Well, thanks. It's 3:45 on a Saturday, so no pressure on me at all to be entertaining. I, I should thank you all for sticking around, and I definitely should thank David and I do thank David and his co-organisers for inviting me. My presentation today is not going to touch on drug policy, although I'm always happy to talk about that, but it's going to use examples more from urban planning and from, and in some ways from city marketing to some extent, and mostly drawing on cases from Vancouver. This billboard here is on a condo and office building that's being built in Vancouver, and there's lots of these kind of signs and adverts, as there are in many cities. Always this overblown rhetoric that comes along with the condo marketing industry, which is must be a multi-million-dollar, maybe billion-dollar industry around the world as English graduates go in to develop slogans for and images for condo tours. Bear that in mind as we go on through this presentation. There's ways in which I'm going to be talking about the way in which cities talk themselves up. So as David said, I'm going to talk about futures and fortunes, urban space and urban life in a world of memes, and hopefully as the presentation goes on, all those elements of that title I'll touch on and try to unpack a little bit. But what I actually wanted to start with real quick is I wanted to start with the title of this workshop and the way that it resonated with me. So the workshop talks about dreams and schemes and memes as being the hooks in which all our discussions have been around, and that resonated with me because it made me remember something that happened in Lexington, Kentucky. Which is where I did my PhD in the mid-1990s. So I was at the University of Kentucky at this time when this incident happened in Lexington. In October of 1994, a young black man was shot to death by a police officer who was trying to arrest him on suspicion of having dealt drugs. This set off what the local newspaper, as you can see there, the next morning referred to as a rampage. It was also talked about as being a riot, and other people talked about it as being a legitimate protest. And it was a protest mostly of people from Lexington's African American community. The shooting took place in a public housing complex in the city that it was largely the home of African American people. So this event was quite traumatizing for many people in Lexington who didn't think that these kind of quote unquote big city problems could happen in this mid-sized American city, and it led to a lot of comment in the days, weeks, months afterwards. A couple of days afterwards, in that same local newspaper, the local editorial cartoonist for the newspaper represented the city this way, as being very starkly divided between black and white. In the months following that, I was involved partly because my research was around issues of urban development and race and class and so on in Lexington. Partly for that reason, and partly out of other interests, I ended up getting involved in something called the Lexington Citizen Summit, which was directly related and came out of as a reaction to the divisions that seemed to be highlighted from the shooting of that young black man. Lexington Citizen Summit then was a group of white and black residents of the city who got together and tried to create an event where they would vision an alternative future for the city where these kind of divisions would be broken down. And the format of it was actually quite similar to the exercise we engaged in early on yesterday, where people were allowed to present what they thought of as the most crucial elements of what was wrong with the city and how it could be made better, and then discussion was intended to take place. The result of this, and it happened a couple of years, and by the second year I was involved on the organising committee of it, but this year especially, the outcome of it was a document, and the document was titled, and I didn't come up with this title, but the document was titled Strategies, Plans, Dreams and Schemes from the Lexington Citizen Summit. So when I got this invitation to come here, I was like, oh wow, we're still talking about dreams and schemes, and that's a good thing. So as well as this being a sort of trip down memory lane for me, the other reason that I mention these resonances with Lexington in the mid-1990s is that when people are met with challenges and problems and crises in cities, they look for solutions by engaging with each other, and we were talking about that even just before the break, the way in which collective action and collective engagement is important for this. And also sometimes they will look, or quite often, they will look to solve local problems by referencing places elsewhere. And that's one of the reasons why I thought this was a useful way to begin, because I think that's a lot of what we've been talking about in this conference. The other thing I would say is that this example and its relationship to this notion of dreaming and scheming for alternative futures shows that models and elsewhere's references to elsewhere and dreams and schemes are not entirely just about urbanisation, and this is, I think, also something that I think has come out through this conference. Yes, in many ways we're talking about urban development, but there's more going on in how people are thinking about their cities and how they're trying to make their cities better. In many ways, these dreams and schemes are about urbanism, in the sense of, not just in the sort of design sense. Architects will sometimes talk about urbanism, but also urbanism as life, and the social life of cities being important, not just the design or the physical built environments of cities. And of course, in some cases, not just life, but also death. So these are important issues that people come together to dream about and to scheme about. When people reference other places, they are intending in one way or another to find ways to mobilise examples, to mobilise best practices or models from elsewhere and bring them locally to develop some sort of alternative future. And a question that has motivated a lot of my work in recent years has been this question, not so much of why policies and models and ideas are mobilised, but rather how are policies, models and ideas mobilised. So I've been interested in the years in trying to unpack the various elements of the how of policy mobilisation and what that might mean for us, and it's one of the things that I'm going to talk about as we go on. So the way that a number of people in geography and urban studies have thought about this question of how policy models are moved from one place to another, and how certain policy models get defined as being models worth moving, and how they get constructed as mobilisable in ways that other alternative models sometimes aren't. These questions have been framed by this notion of policy mobilities in urban geography and urban studies literatures in recent years. And what I thought I would do to begin with is to try to talk about what I mean by policy mobilities. What are the sort of guiding questions within this literature, trying to get at the question of how do models move, and then try to unpack that a little bit. For the two or three of you who are in the room who were at my NUS talk a couple of days ago, I apologise for the next 3 slides because you've seen them before, so you can take a break for a couple of minutes. This policy mobilities literature is looking at a world of circulating models, and is looking at a whole set of practices, generalised practices of comparison and interreferencing that seem to be going on through and among cities. So the policy mobilities literature then is asking these sorts of questions. Who mobilises certain models? And who is mobilised by them? How are policies rendered mobile, as I suggested already? What infrastructures enable and channel policy mobilities? What sites and spaces are both shaped and also shape mobilisation? And quite fundamentally for me as an urban political geographer, I would say the question of what are the politics of this global relational policy making and knowledge making. So there's been 2 presentations already today that have done the list of points thing. One did 6, one did 8. I'm doing 7, so it works out quite nicely. It's entirely coincidental, I have to say, but it was nice. So here are seven elements of this approach to thinking about how is it that policies or models or ideas get moved. The first one is assemblage, which has many connotations of various levels of theoretical abstraction. For me, what I'm interested in when I talk about assemblage is literally the work and practice of bringing elements from elsewhere together into a particular combination, particular assemblage that is intended to work in a specific locality. That assemblage process as a social process, as work, involves various interests in various institutions. So not every element of the world out there is equally likely to be brought into a particular place. It's partly related to the interests and the institutions that are involved in the assemblage process. Mobilities, that term itself, which suggests that the movement of models or ideas or policies is very much a socio-spatial process. It doesn't happen naturally, but it's a social process across space. And again, it's hegemonically structured. Certain models are likely to be acknowledged as worth moving by hegemonic interests, whereas other ones that maybe don't, that maybe work against or talk against hegemonic interest, neoliberal interests, just as one example. Those models that talk against that hegemony may be less likely to be moved. So we have to think about ideology and ideological fields when we're thinking about this process. Mutation, as policies move, they don't stay the same, right? So this is not like moving gifts around at a birthday party. You don't put the gift in a box, move it someplace else, and it comes out of the box exactly the same. The process of movement, the process of transference, if you like, changes the policy as it moves, as it is embedded in new places. And in the other sense, the mobilization of policy changes the places through which it moves to. So mobile policies change. That has both those connotations. And that process of mobilizing policy is to a great extent about persuasive storytelling. The politics of this for me as an urban political geographer is about governance. Policies are about governance, but it's also about persuasion and about contest and argumentation over what's best and what's best for whom. So representational strategies, particularly persuasive storytelling about elsewhere, about here, about the past, about the future, are very important. And that storytelling, to a greater or lesser extent, often involves evidence, the presentation of evidence. And we've seen that in some of the presentations over the last couple of days. It also involves policy tourism. The idea that you can't just learn about a policy from reading about it or hearing about it at a distance, but often people involved in policy making, politicians and so on, value the visceral, the tacit. They want to go to the place where the policy has been a success or is presented as a success and experience it there, often in ways that has quite a strong influence on how they bring it back to their locality. And again, all that persuasion, that sense of being convinced is very much political. All of these movements and persuasions are framed and facilitated by informational infrastructures and institutional infrastructures too, I would say. So as these policies move, they're being framed by states, by international organizations, by consultants and policy gurus, by educators, by social movements and by the media. All of this, in turn, relies on certain definitions of expertise. And this notion from Nicholas Rose of experts of truth, people who for one reason or another gain credence as people who can tell the story of someplace else, either because they've experienced it, partly sometimes in the case of mayors who then go on to be consultants and travel around the world, maybe because they position themselves as the one who created a successful cycling policy or bus rapid transit policy or something in some other part of the world and bring it to your city, get paid handsomely to do it and tell you the story. But they're anointed with certain levels of credence. They're credentialized. And at the same time, they themselves are anointing and credentializing because they pick out certain policy models that they say are the ones that work. And don't pay attention to these other ones, these alternative counter-hegemonic movements. So these can often include agents of international development and humanitarian agencies, but many others as well. And finally, I would say that when I talk about policy mobilities, I increasingly feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about policy because it often can be constraining. It often leads us to think that we're talking about written policies, when actually what I'm interested in is moving ideas. I'm interested in ideas that move from place to place and ideas that move people, that have resonance. And that's, again, the politics of this. It can be about policies themselves, but it also can be about ideas about how to change policy or ideas that haven't quite been written up as policies yet. And that sort of future orientation is something we've been talking about through the conference too. In the case of what I've said here, we're talking about vehicular ideas, which is a term I draw from a sociologist called Gregor McCann in the UK. And he talks about these vehicular ideas as being ideas that are vague enough but also valuable enough to gather coalitions of people around them. In a sense, kind of empty signifiers where people can read into them in particular ways. And they allow conversations to carry on, even if people have other disagreements. They come around certain ideas and move things on. So sustainability would be an example of that. It's not one that I particularly study, but it's a common example of these kind of vehicular ideas. And again, I would say, again, as a political geographer, I would say these are very much running through and directed towards institutions of various types. So these are the kind of 7 broad themes in policy mobilities literature that me and many others have worked on in the last number of years, and there's quite a lot of literature out there on these kind of themes and using different examples to explore these themes. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about some elements of this process that I think relate to some of the conversations we've had in this conference. The first thing I want to talk about is the future and the future orientation that is quite obviously central, is a central trope of planning. And of architecture and design and so on. And we've heard this, of course, through the whole conference. But I think it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to suggest that a future orientation, a concern, perhaps increasingly an anxiety with the future, can be seen as something that is increasingly socially generalized. We can think about that obviously in terms of concerns about the future of the environment with climate change and so on. We can think about it in terms of the future that our students might or might not have as they come out of university, where the future of employment seems to be so uncertain, and it's not surprising then that our students are so concerned about that and make choices about what topics they study in university, for example, based on what they think and what their parents think is going to lead to good jobs, right? So there's an awful lot of sort of future and maybe futurist politics that is quite general in society right now. And the references yesterday in the presentations to the Future of Us exhibit in Singapore clearly talks to that as well. The future then for planners and for many others, as we've seen in this conference, the future then is something to be corralled and tamed, something to be channeled and directed in a particular way. But it's also something to be contested, that not everybody is in agreement about how the future should be shaped or how we should try to shape the future. there's also this sense through the conference that the future is somewhere, or perhaps somewhere else. And what a lot of these memes and dreams and schemes are about is trying to capture that future from someplace else and make it work here, wherever here happens to be, not just Singapore. Okay. But we can think about futures not just in the present. This is not just a new thing, as much as I was arguing earlier that maybe it's enhanced these days. But we can look at futures from the past. So the discussion yesterday was encouraging us to look 50 years into the future, right? To define that future 50 years. So I tried to look 50 years into the past and think, you know, what were the references to futures back then? I didn't quite get exactly 50 years, but I got like 45 years and then 40 years back into the past with a couple of references from popular culture. Both of them quite depressing and nihilistic references, I have to say. So the Doors, Roadhouse Blues, save our city, the future's uncertain, and the end is always near. The Sex Pistols, 1977, there is no future. Don't be told what you want. Don't be told what you need. There's no future, no future, no future for you. And that's from God Save the Queen. The original title for God Save the Queen was No Future. And they eventually changed it just before the album came out. So these are obviously quite negative and depressing, and I would say that it's important to remember that there are many, we can all think of many social movements from the 1960s onwards that have looked to the future in much more optimistic and progressive terms than Jim Morrison and John Lydon did, right? So this is not to say this is the only future from the past that we can look to, but it gives a little bit of an interesting framing for what I'm going to talk about next. Because today we are told to look at the future. The hegemonic idea of how we're told to look to the future is always bright and sunny, right? As our new Canadian Prime Minister said on his election night, sunny ways, right? Everything is going to be good if we all just buy into the neoliberal model. So in the case of my city, Vancouver, that involves a model of corralling the economy, a new sort of green economy, to a green planning agenda. At least this is what the mayor would like us to believe. We will be the greenest city in the world by 2020. Right? So the future is global for a city like Vancouver. Global in the sense of competing with other cities to be the greenest and have the best green economy and so on, and also to be global in the sense of preserving the world. Cities being the ones that are going to make changes to the world more than nations. This then is reflected locally in hegemonic stories that are repeated in various ways, not just verbally, but also in images, in exhibits, like the Museum of Vancouver's recent exhibit that just ended a couple of weeks ago called Your Future Home, Creating the New Vancouver, which is, as one of my recent graduate students who went to it said, it was very much a developer's dream of the future of Vancouver. So your future home, as long as you buy into a particular model of development. So what we're talking about then is narrative power and visual power in the process of developing and defining what models are worth pursuing. So in Vancouver, the narrative, the visual, is a scaled-down version of the Hong Kong model that John earlier today criticised in quite strong terms as not being the utopia that it sometimes is talked about in Vancouver. So downtown living, skinny towers, relatively tall, at least by Vancouver standards. This model of what has now been branded in Vancouver by local interests, the interests of the private architecture and engineering firms and so on, has been branded as quote-unquote Vancouverism. This, of course, for a relatively provincial city, oh, I forgot this was being recorded, I hope nobody in Vancouver heard me saying that. A smaller city, let's say, on the west coast of Canada, it was particularly important for them to have Vancouverism talked about in the New York Times in 2005. So the New York Times said, They defined Vancouverism as characterised by tall but widely separated, slender towers interspersed with low-rise buildings, public spaces, small parks and pedestrian-friendly streetscapes, and facades to minimise the impact of a high-density population. So this is Vancouverism, an urban model, a policy made concrete and a policy made into a marketing model. The image on the right here is the front page of a brochure or a website that was also a brochure for an exhibit held during the Winter Olympics in 2010 that played up this notion of Vancouverism and presented to visitors but also to locals, presented this contribution to urbanism that Vancouver has or we're being told has presented to the world. A contribution that involves design, transferring from original sketches into architectural models, which of course are convincing in themselves, the power of the visual, the power of the tactile, even at a miniature scale, for example. The presentation of particular models of how things might be designed as choices, as if all we need to do is choose what's best for us in a quite individualistic way. And this exhibit presenting certain models of how things are done in Vancouver as something to be proud of in the city, something that other places in the world look to as a model, and that then is politically powerful locally as a narrative, as a visual and otherwise narrative. Okay. So in that sense then, we're not just talking about extrospective politics, we're not just talking about the mobilisation and talking up of models to other places and that connection. We're not just talking about inviting and hosting delegations from cities in other parts of the world to learn Vancouverism. But there's also something about the politics of telling this story locally that I think is really important. What is the political power of having your local planning and development regime become something that is defined by the global gurus as best practice? What does that do in terms of its ability to curtail and cut off critique within the local political environment? I think this is very important, right? So, for example, from that brochure that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, the authors of the brochure put it this way: American architects and city planners over the past decade began speaking of Vancouverizing their underpopulated, unloved urban cores. This is classic. Canadians want to get one up on America, right? Our city has become first a verb and now an ideology. This is the transfer to the new computer. That box is supposed to be around our city. An ideology promoting an urbanism of density and public amenity. The point here, the point of the box, if it had been located correctly there, was that they start talking about our city. So they're talking to a local audience, and they're enrolling that local audience in a singular view of what the best planning model should be. This is then replicated more recently. This was last summer in a neighbourhood in Vancouver, where they held a retrospective on this greenest city approach after a number of years. And they presented an exhibit of the things that are going well in the city, how there's been reductions in CO2 emissions and so on. There's obvious appeals to choice here again, individual choice and consumerism as the way out of environmental crisis. Making a choice to shop locally and so on, which I'm not critiquing in the sense that it is a good thing, but also there are questions there about whether or not those individual choices can be scaled up in ways that work for cities or beyond. But also that exhibit also was also an exercise in governmentality in a sense. It's also prompting people to do more. To become more renewable, to reduce energy, to be more efficient, to switch to renewable energy resources. So the internal politics of this of Vancouverism as a model is also about trying to instill a new ethos within the local population about how to behave, to govern their own conduct in the micro level as part of a wider model. And that, again, as I said earlier, is tied to an economic model or an economic vision of creating a green economy in Vancouver. The argument very simply being that if we plan green, then people who might be interested in starting green industries are more likely to come to our city rather than Calgary or Seattle or wherever it might be. And if you're standing at this bus stop, then you're already a green capitalist, so congratulations. Well, part of the issue here is problem definition. How is it that we're defining our problem here? And clearly there's a lot of power in and behind that definition of a problem and a solution that we saw there a few seconds ago. So there are certain crises that become the motivations for creating new models, for looking elsewhere to import models. So crises are times for making decisions. They're always political moments, because interests are then benefited, other interests are not benefited by the decisions that are made in crisis situations and through the definition of crisis. There are certainly possibilities and constraints for change, as Ananya talked about in her presentation in the first day. And ideas and policies are mobilized in reference to crisis. So beyond the environmental issues in Vancouver, another crisis that motivates almost every conversation in the city these days, and rightly so, is the expense of the housing market. And this plays out in a couple of ways. So the standard way to define how unaffordable a housing market is globally is not just to look at the cost of an average house, but is to compare the cost of an average house to the average wage of a worker living in the city. And when that's done in Vancouver, Vancouver is one of the two or three top or bottom. It's one of the two or three least affordable housing markets in the world because of the distinct gap between the average house price and the average worker's salary. I did a calculation recently, just a very rough calculation that is roughly correct, which says that the average house in Vancouver makes 5 times as much money in a given month as the average worker makes. So that increase in the amount of value in the housing market versus how much workers are making to be able to afford housing has related to this sort of rise in middle class affordability politics. So this meme on Twitter, generated by this woman Evelyn Shia, is this "don't have a million" argument, and she organised a rally in downtown Vancouver. It wasn't the best attended rally, but it got a lot of journalistic attention, and it's raised it's part of a much larger discussion about whether middle class people can live in Vancouver anymore. Right? For me, I am obviously implicated in that discussion in many ways, but I'm more interested in working at a different register of this debate about affordability and the crisis of the housing crisis in a place like Vancouver. I have done a little bit of work. I work, I wouldn't say I'm at the centre of this, but I work and help out with this organisation when I can in Vancouver called the Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative. This is a group of people in Vancouver who live in or who are engaged in helping to preserve and improve single-room occupancy hotels, rooming houses in Vancouver as the last resort for poor people before they end up on the street. Now, these SROs are very often terrible, terrible places. Rat-infested, violent, horrible places. But in an environment since the 1990s where the federal government in Canada has not invested in social housing, they're the best we have. So this organisation has, on the one hand, pushed the owners of these SROs using city powers to improve them, to not allow an elevator to be out of commission for 3 months when disabled elderly people live on the top floor of these places, where not allow the water to be out or the heat to be out for a couple of months over the winter. Pushing for change, bringing legal actions is one thing they do. And then the other thing they've been trying to do is find ways to protect the SROs so that they don't get turned into backpacker hostels, tourist hotels and so on, and therefore maintain some housing for these folks who live in them. And the reason that's relevant here is because they model their strategy for protecting these SROs on a model from San Francisco. The collaborative idea, the SRO collaborative idea, is something that has preserved a lot of SRO rooms in San Francisco. And a few months ago at the Association of American Geographers Conference, a number of us, not just me, other geographers, were able to go down to San Francisco with a group of these activists and be able to meet with their counterparts in San Francisco and be able to meet with city staff in San Francisco. So Nick Blomley, my colleague, and me, Jeff Masuda from Queens, Audrey Kobayashi, spent our time going between our usual academic conference, bouncing between that and meetings with activists and policymakers in the city over that week. And eventually the activists came back and held this meeting in the downtown East Side neighborhood of Vancouver, where they brought the lessons from San Francisco back to the local community. This local community has a lot of Chinese seniors in it, which means that all these meetings are always being translated into Cantonese at the same time as in English, with the idea being that this model from San Francisco can maybe help preserve what's left of affordable housing for the very poor in Vancouver. I'm going to skip that. So, in conclusion then, and this is the last slide, what we're talking about here obviously is about mobilizing models, but doing so not, as I got to at the end there, not doing so only to reinforce hegemonic ideas about how cities should be built. But also, by the end there, what I was trying to suggest is that there are ways in which counter-hegemonic models of development and of preservation of low-income housing in a very limited sense might be able to be moved through similar channels. And this leads us back to some of the key themes from the presentation and from the conference. First of all, futures. So future orientation can in some ways be anxiety producing, as we were saying earlier, but it also has the opportunity to produce political movement. And I think that's worth making. Fortunes, well, when we're talking about urban life as well as urbanization, then we're talking about people's fortunes. What is their fortune going to be like? Are they going to be able to live in the house in the community they've lived in all their lives for much longer? But it's also when we're talking about contesting development models, we're talking about fortunes in the financial sense too. And this is where the politics becomes very difficult, because there are very strong interests who make a fortune off of housing and off of developing and redeveloping cities that are ranked against people who are trying to push for something different. Dreams. Well, we've talked about at this conference, I feel, we've talked about dreams as being something that or being something that is generally happy and optimistic. You're a dreamer, right? You're maybe not attached to this world and tend to look on the positive side. But as we all know, if we think about it, dreams can often be disturbing, unsettling, thought-provoking. They can sometimes be memorable, but very often they're not memorable. Oh, I know I dreamed about something last night, but I can't remember what it was, right? And of course, they can be scary. There's such a category of scary dreams that it has its own name, right? And when we think about dreams, we might also think about urban nightmares as a way of an alternative form of defining a problem and looking for alternative solutions. So there's a lot to think about when we talk about dreams and not just take it as a term for granted. And then, of course, this all leads back to memes, where there is this continual movement and churning of ideas about how best to model the future of cities. And that's something that has to be intervened into, and not just to be assumed that it's always going to be hegemonic, but to find ways for political openings to do something different. Thanks.